Morning from Washington, D.C., and good evening to those of you in China. Welcome to, I think I don't need to introduce myself, right? Welcome to USET's first virtual program, and please watch for more to come. And there will be more. Since we cannot bring USET's long-standing election programs to you in person this year, we hope this Live from Washington series can zoom the excitement, the uncertainties, and the facts of this presidential race to you through cyberspace. You cannot miss this election, as its outcome will affect not just Americans, but also geopolitics, US-China relations, and millions of lives around the world for years to come. I have the honor to introduce our two speakers today. I will not take too much time because we've already sent you their bios, and you can also click the link in chat and find their bios there now. Since this is our first time of gathering in cyberspace, you can get technical support if you need it by private message to USET, again in chat. Also, you can email info@uset.org for help, for support. We have a technician standing by, ready to help. Again, you could email info@uset.org for support. And when you want to ask a question, please, again, submit it in chat. Now on to our introductions. First, James A. Thurber, University Distinguished Professor of Government and founding director of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University, may not need much introduction to this audience, as he has advised and headlined USET programs on American politics, the Congress and presidential elections since 2001, when USET launched China's first Congressional Studies program at Fudan University. Hey there, Sunza. We did it together, remember? In fact, the Chinese government recognized Professor Thurber's expertise as early as 1987, when he was invited to lecture there. Professor Thurber is quite unique in his field, as he is not only a respected academic with many, many publications under his belt, but also someone with broad public affairs and practical experience in American politics. He served 2 Democrat senators and 1 Republican, as well as a powerful Democrat congressman. He not only founded the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at AU, but he also founded the Campaign Management Institute, the Public Affairs and Advocacy Institute, and its counterpart in Brussels. Now let's turn to Professor Wang. Stephen Wang, Professor of Government Emeritus at Georgetown University, is new to USET, but he is a long-time associate of Professor Thurber's, and his association with Professor Thurber is even longer than USET's association with Professor Thurber. I would say that there are few scholars who are more expert than Professor Wang on the American presidency. He has written 12 books, several in multiple editions, and over 100 articles, chapters, and book reviews. Professor Wang also has served as president of the Presidency Research Group and the National Capital Area Political Science Association. Not only does he lecture frequently in the United States and around the world, he also testifies before the Congress, advises both the Republican and Democratic national committees, and works as a consultant on film documentaries on the American presidency. So we are very fortunate to have these two eminent scholars with us. Now let's turn to Professor Wang, who will speak first.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all. I can't see, but I'm sure I will hear. My job is to talk a little bit about the presidential election, what has been and what may be. This presidential election, normally presidential elections last about 2 years. They occur right after the midterm elections, when all the members of the House and about 1/3 of the Senate are subject to election or re-election. This one has been a little bit longer. The first step in this election was taken by President-elect Donald Trump. That means after he won the Electoral College vote, and we'll talk about the Electoral College later, but before he took the oath of office. He established or reestablished his Finance Committee, and between the time he was elected and the time he took office, he raised $11 million. And then on the day he was inaugurated, he filed the necessary papers for re-election. So for Donald Trump, the election of 2016 never ended, and he is continuing. Over the last 3.5 years, he has raised a total of $232 million. Most of that money comes from small donations. The US election law allows a candidate to raise $2,800 from each person for each election, with the nomination of the candidate counting as 1 and the general election counting as 2. Most of Mr. Trump's contributions have been less than $200. Of course, there are other ways that wealthy people can and do help the candidates, and I'll refer to those a little bit later. In 2017, he nominated the man who was in charge of his digital campaign for 2016 to be the head of his new campaign. And within the next 3 years, he amassed a staff of well over 400 people, all paid. The headquarters are in Trump Towers in New York, as they were in the previous election. And he has representatives in all the states. But because of the peculiarities of the US system, most of the representatives are in what we call battleground states, very, very close states whose outcome will decide the Electoral College vote. Whose outcome will decide who will be the president of the United States in 2021. So Trump has been out there right along. He's conducted very large rallies until the virus hit. He has tweeted his campaign online, and his tweets, which are usually unconventional and controversial, have been picked up by the media and then reinforced by a mechanism of both his advisors and what we call robots or bots, which automatically reinforce and send the messages to Trump's supporters. And his supporters love him. We have a very partisan divide in the United States today, and of the people who identify themselves as Republicans, approximately 90% or so, maybe even a little higher, have enthusiastic support for the president. So he's done what he needed to do to get ready for this campaign. And it was a traditional big bucks, big staff, lots of publicity campaign focused on Facebook and to a lesser extent Google. Not too many television ads, although he did one during the last World Series in baseball and the last Super Bowl. So he does reach out in general. We all knew he'd be the nominee anyway. He had only minimal opposition, and that faded very, very quickly. So he wasn't challenged. In fact, there was so little challenge that a number of Republican parties in different states canceled their primary elections, where they choose the person who they want to be the party's nominee. So Donald Trump started out of the gate very fast, has been running very fast, and has been running exactly the kind of campaign he ran in 2016, except he has attracted approximately 700,000 volunteers, and he has used traditional television media as well as digital media, and he has stayed front and center throughout this period until the virus hit the United States. Now, if I may turn to the Democratic Party, 29 candidates announced that they wanted to be the Democratic nominee. Most of these candidates made that announcement in the winter, in December and January 2018, 2019. A couple, one a millionaire from Maryland, another a millionaire from New York, announced a little earlier. With the exception of Vice President Biden, none of the candidates were really nationally known. They were senators, they were governors. One was a billionaire investor who was very concerned about the economy. Later in the race, in November of 2019, Michael Bloomberg, who owns Bloomberg News and has a fortune that some say is in excess of $50 billion, came in and spent more money than any other candidate had ever spent on a nomination process, to no avail, I might add, but he spent the money. And so television stations and Facebook and Google prospered, but the American people, only 8% actually voted for him. Now, the democratic process is such that there are really two stages, sometimes three stages to it. The Democrats have a calendar, and the calendar begins on the first Tuesday in the month of March, the third month of the year. But they allow 4 states, by tradition and by choice, 3 of whom are fairly small states, and 1 is a medium-sized state, to hold their contests earlier. These states are New Hampshire, Nevada, Iowa, which holds the first caucus election, and South Carolina. Iowa has traditionally been the first caucus. New Hampshire has traditionally been the first primary. They are small states made up predominantly of people who are white, who are Christian, and who don't really represent a lot of the diversity within the Democratic Party. So Nevada was added to include a state that has a substantial Hispanic population, and South Carolina was added to add a state that has a significant African American population, and actually that population constitutes a majority of people who identify themselves as Democrats in the state of South Carolina. Now, in the first 3 contests, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, Bernie Sanders, who challenged Hillary Clinton in 2016, won the most popular votes, and more of the votes for the delegates who will attend the convention that formally nominates the president than anyone else. But the Democrats don't have winner-take-all voting. They have voting where you get the number of delegates equal to the percentage of the vote you receive, so long as you receive at least 15% of the vote. So Sanders was ahead. Now, Sanders is a very liberal candidate. He's an independent socialist. Socialist has not been a very popular word in the United States since the Cold War, maybe even before it. And he was ahead, and there was a fear among many of the more moderate Democrats that if he wasn't stopped, he'd win the nomination. If he won the election, if he won the nomination, he'd lose to Donald Trump in the general election, in part because of his ideological views, which are somewhat to the left of a majority of Americans. And he'd also bring down other Democrats who were running who would be scared of him. In the fourth early election in South Carolina, Joe Biden, who had a national reputation, was very well known, was liked, I wouldn't say loved, he was liked, he was viewed as an experience, a good guy, without all the negatives that Hillary Clinton had. He won an overwhelming vote in South Carolina. And following that vote, a lot of the early candidates who did not do well in the first three states and who spent a lot of money, some of them in South Carolina, dropped out. And all but one at the time endorsed Joe Biden. So when we got to the first Tuesday in March, where a lot of the contests were held, we refer to that as Super Tuesday, Biden won the popular vote in most of the states and got a fairly large lead over Bernie Sanders, and the candidates who had dropped out endorsed Biden. So all at once, he was the front runner. He didn't have the largest organization. He didn't have the most money. He didn't make the most advertisements. But there was Democrats felt that he would be their strongest candidate because he had the broadest possible appeal to the Democratic electoral coalition. Now, a lot of money was spent during this period. I have some figures on this. Probably more money was spent during this period than in any other early period. And Republicans spent $161 million, and the Democrats spent over $1.1 billion, with Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, two multi-billionaires, spending the most money. So it looked like it was going to be a very expensive general election, but there was a consensus about the candidates. Now remember, that was early March. Then COVID-19, the virus, hit the United States. And while we had 2 more weeks of primaries, which people participated in, and which Biden won and extended his popular vote lead and delegate vote lead, the campaign was muted by the virus, and still is. So the third phase is that we know Biden's going to win the Democratic nomination, and we know that Trump will be the Republican nominee, but we haven't seen the visual kind of campaigning that we normally see. Trump couldn't hold big rallies anymore. Neither could Biden. Trump was overwhelmed by the news of the virus. It used to be that Trump made news by his uncharacteristic, unconventional, controversial decisions, actions, hirings, firings. It was a very different presidency than we were used to as Americans. And as much as the Republicans liked Trump, the Democrats hated him, and with as much passion. They probably, I think it's fair to say, and Professor Thurber can comment, disliked Trump much more than they liked Biden. In other words, Biden was okay, he was a nice guy, but the most important thing was to get Trump out of the presidency. So once the virus hit, it became the big news, and we got involved in a policy called social distancing, which I'm sure you've all practiced in China. And we had a steady rise. We've had over 100,000 deaths in the United States. We've had over 1.2 million people who have had the virus in one way or another. And almost all the state, and there, as you know, there is no vaccine for it yet. There is no medicine to cure it yet, although there is one drug that has been used to shorten hospital stays a little bit. But beyond that, people were frightened, people were scared, and people had to behave very differently. If they stayed at home, they didn't buy. 40 million people lost their jobs, restaurants closed, parks closed, all sporting events were canceled, and people stayed home. And as a result, the stock market in the United States dropped very precipitously in the month of, at the end of March and the beginning of April. And it looked like the United States was headed towards a recession, had an incurable virus that was spreading around. And President Trump was very slow to respond. He made a couple of statements at the very beginning. This is no problem. We're not allowing Chinese planes to come into the United States with people who might have gotten the virus in Hunan or other places. We found out later that most of the viruses that spread in the United States came from Europe, where flights continued for several more weeks before they were stopped. And so what happened at the outset was that the COVID-19 virus muted the campaign. It became front page news. It also changed the candidates' strategies. Biden was stuck at home. He built a television studio in his basement, and they moved it upstairs. They had a little more light. And he engaged in a digital advertising campaign as well as a campaign to raise more money. And there are ways to do that. If you're interested, I can talk about them briefly later. The original plan that Donald Trump had was that he was going to have over 1 million volunteers knock on doors in areas where Trump was popular and get a lot of people out to vote. Well, with social distancing, knocking on doors became something that wasn't very realistic. People didn't want to go to other neighborhoods and knock on doors, whether they had a face mask on or not. So the campaign became digital. And Biden was in a tough situation in the sense that he didn't hold public office. He had been a former vice president. He was stuck in his house. He couldn't influence the policy that Congress was passing. Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker of the House. She's a Democrat. Mitch McConnell is the majority leader of the Senate. He's a Republican. Any bill President Trump had to sign. And where was Biden, really influencing this? So he did the best he could at home and tried to focus on building an organization. And that's where he is at the moment. And at first, Democrats say, well, you got to get out there. You got to have more visibility. But since the news has been bad rather than good, it may very well be that staying at home is the best policy. Now, what comes ahead? The Democrats were to hold their nominating convention in July in Milwaukee, but with the virus, they postponed it to August, the middle of August. And now it looks like they're not going to hold an actual convention, but a virtual convention like we're doing right now. And then Biden will be formally nominated and the party will adopt a platform. Trump wants the Republicans to have a regular convention. It's scheduled to occur in North Carolina. Whether it occurs there or not, we're not sure, but he wants people without masks at the convention cheering and yelling for him because he likes that. He feels that he's more powerful politically, and as you may know, he is a very self-interested, self-promoting human being. He needs to be front and center. He needs to take credit for everything good and blame everything bad on somebody else, be it the Democrats or a Republican or the China, for he refers to the COVID-19 as the Chinese virus and, things like that. He's the kind of person who puts blame on others and takes credit for himself. Most politicians try to do that too, but not as overtly as Donald Trump does. So at the end of August, the convention will begin. The election is the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November. The Trump campaign and the election will be concentrated in what we call the Electoral College. Now, that means we don't have a popular vote for president. We have a popular vote within the states for president. And in 48 of the 50 states, whichever candidate wins the popular vote, that candidate gets all the states' electoral votes. And the states, number of states' electoral votes equals the number of senators and representatives they have. They have 2 senators, and they have anywhere from one, I think California has 53 or 54 representatives. So the bigger states have more clout, and it's basically winner take all voting. Now, the election will occur in a very fluid political environment. Dr. Thurber is going to talk about the political polarization, but there are going to be 3 major policy areas that will decide the election. One is the virus itself, and whether after reducing distancing and opening restaurants, we get a resurgence of that, which will not work to President Trump's advantage. The second is the economy. Will people be getting back to work? Most people now who have lost their jobs are getting unemployment insurance, which is more than half of their regular salaries. But that lasts, I think, only for 13 weeks, and there'll be a big fight over whether to extend that. So the state of the economy will be another issue. You remember 4 years ago, Trump promised jobs, but now 40 million Americans are unemployed. The third issue, somewhat more recent, but most recent in an exposure is race. There was a man who was killed an African-American man who was killed by a white policeman who put his knee on the man's neck so he couldn't breathe, even though the man was in handcuffs. And we have now had demonstrations for 3 consecutive days in major cities and before the White House, clashes with police, some fires and some damage. And we don't know how race is going to play in this election. We know that it will unify the African American population and the liberal Democrats. We know that it may also unify white, particularly male conservatives who tend to be Republican. So the pandemic, the economy, and race are likely to be the 3 critical issues, although if there is some environmental crisis, that could be the 4th issue that could generate it. Most of the campaign will take place in the most competitive states. In the last election, Donald Trump did not win the most popular votes. He won 2.5 million less votes than Hillary Clinton had. But he had the most electoral votes. You need 270 electoral votes in the Electoral College to win. And Donald Trump had 302, I believe, electoral votes. So he did well in that. Now, there are a number of states, what we call critical states, and he won in the last election 3 states in the Midwest and 1 on the Atlantic: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The difference today is that each of those states now has a Democratic governor, where before it had a Republican governor. And that's very important if the vote itself is disputed, as I suspect it might be, particularly if Trump loses by a small amount. There are 3 states that Trump won the last time that Democrats think they have a chance this time in. They're in the South or Southwest: Florida, North Carolina, and Arizona. And there are a few states in the country, Maine, New Hampshire, and now Minnesota, because that's where this racial incident occurred, perhaps Nevada, where the Republicans think they have a chance. So most of the campaign will be on digital media and local television in these states. Most of the workers will be in the states that I've just mentioned. And we will have a number of debates between the candidates. Debates acquire a lot of attention. Theoretically, they're spontaneous, unlike the ads. In practice, the candidates practice. They anticipate the questions. They have prepared answers. They sound like their ads. We always thought debates would be very important in a close election. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was credited with doing much better than Donald Trump in the 4 debates, and yet she lost the election. So I think debates are overrated in terms of their impact on the vote. Now, the strategy of the Trump campaign will be threefold. 1, they will point to certain achievements that they have made, particularly those that don't conflict with the economic downturn: pulling out of treaties, getting fairer trade agreements, reducing the number of troops in Afghanistan, things like that. They will also raise more money than the Democrats will. They have about a 2-to-1 lead now. As I mentioned, the people who support Trump support him with a great deal of intensity. He's a fairly good debater, if you're not as concerned with facts as you are with rhetoric and getting people excited. Joe Biden is going to campaign as an experienced, moderate to liberal Democrat. He's going to try to raise money, and I think he'll have enough money to win. It's interesting to note that Hillary Clinton had more money than Donald Trump, and she lost. 4 years before that, Mitt Romney, the Republican candidate, had more money than Obama, and he lost. So money is important to gain recognition. Money is important to mount advertisements, but money does not necessarily dictate election results, and it certainly hasn't in the last 2 elections, and I don't think it will in this election as well. Now, the real difference is that the Biden will emphasize the personality characteristics that many people believe Trump lacks. He will come across as authoritative, but very consistent. President Trump has vacillated a great deal. He will take advice. He will make statements that basically are more in accord with empirical and scientific research than the president has made. He will try to show his humanity. He will try to show his empathy. He will try to say that I will govern more like Barack Obama than the way we're being governed now. And he'll promote democratic values. So Trump will appear as a big, strong, controversial, I can do it, just give me the power, or I'll take the power. And Biden will campaign more as a Democrat who will compromise, who will try to reach an agreement, who will try to reach out to people, who will not dictate, but will try to conciliate and bring the nation, which is very divided now, together again. So let me stop at this point. I know Dr. Thurber wants to talk about the politics and issues such as who's going to vote and who's not. The last election, about 60% of those who are eligible voted, but where they vote and how they come out, particularly during a pandemic, is very, very important. So let me turn it over to Jim, and I look forward to your questions after Dr. Thurber completes his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. That was excellent. Let me recommend to everybody Steve's latest book, The Road to the White House 2020, and he's just updated the book. It just came out, but he's updated it, and he'll have an update chapter that's available. It is the best book, in my opinion, on elections, and that was an outstanding and very thorough presentation. I do have a PowerPoint, but you've locked me out of you've got to disable the screen access. I can do it without it, but Trenton, you want to disable so I can get in with the PowerPoint? If not, I'll keep looking at that. I'm just going to add a few very brief remarks to Steve's excellent presentation. You all have the PowerPoint sent to you, and I'll talk about what to expect in the 2020 election beyond Steve's and reinforce some of the things that he said. Let me say that the political context in 2020, thank you, it's up. I assume everyone can see the PowerPoint now. Trenton, can you let me know whether that is the case or not? In any case, let's keep going. Sorry. Good. So the political context in 2020, it's unique. It's really unique in American history. Steve has described the COVID-19 pandemic. It has hit all of us very personally. I've been staying in my house for 9 weeks now. having groceries delivered to the house. We've had a peak in Washington, D.C. of deaths and positive infections, and you've read about New York and other places. This is an issue in the campaign that's very important, and connected to it, of course, as Steve said, is the economy. In our nation, if there's a question of the economy, jobs, it becomes the major issue in the campaign. And I'll talk a little bit about how that has affected people getting reelected presidents in the past. It is a somber day with respect to racial tensions. Steve presented that issue. It will be an issue in this campaign. Race has been an issue in America since well before the Civil War. But this time it is bubbling over with National Guard in 24 cities, with statements from Trump that some people think are not that helpful in this situation. And again, Biden being not out and about beyond his house, he's almost invisible in terms of his reaction to what's going on right now. I live close to the White House. I could hear the helicopters last night, and there were fires in front of the White House, and individuals lighting fires in a church across from the White House and damaging the Hay Adams Hotel across from there, but also breaking into the AFL-CIO, which is right there. This has hit Washington, D.C. and many other nations, and I'm not sure when it's going to stop, but it will be part of this election. It may help Trump. It may hurt him. It certainly is a central part of the Democratic strategy to try to do something about this. I'd like to go beyond what Steve was talking about. He referred to it a little bit, and I'll talk about polarization and gridlock. Polarization is here before the pandemic, before the bad economy, and before these racial tensions. And I'd like to talk about some of the causes of this polarization, the characteristics of it, and the impact of it. And then I'd like to talk about what Steve mentioned briefly, and that is the importance of enthusiasm, and enthusiasm linked to voter turnout. Republicans always seem to have more enthusiasm about their candidates, especially Trump. The basic Republican Party members that will vote are quite excited about him. The enthusiasm gap is significant with Biden. People are less enthusiastic about him within the Democratic Party. That may have an impact on turnout. Then Steve has talked about the presidential election. I'll talk a little bit about the Senate elections and the House elections. And what's likely to happen there and what some of the major issues are. Central to this election is, will we have divided party government? Will it continue? Divided party government is the phenomena where there's a different party in the presidency versus the House and the Senate. This makes a great deal of difference. When Obama was in for the first 2 years, he had a so-called presidential support score of 93%. Now, it's a controversial measure, but it's one measure of what he wants and what he got, what he wanted and what he could get out of the House and Senate. He had unified party government. That dropped to the 30th percentile after he lost the House and the Senate, and we had divided party government. The presidential campaign, as Steve said, will be in several battleground states: Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Right now, a meta-analysis, an analysis of a variety of polls done by Charlie Cook, and we've sent links to the Cook report for you, shows that the Democrats have 232 electoral college votes, and the Republicans have 204. You need 270 to win. We'll get into that a little later in greater detail. The House is not very competitive. The off-year elections, we had a huge turnover of 93 new people that came into the House in 2018 and 91 new people that came in 2016. It is very likely that we'll have a Democratic majority in the Senate. There are only about 25 competitive seats, meaning people where they're going to win by 55% or less. Why is this the case? One major reason is that in America, the primary election, the election when we select who will be on the final ballot, is frequently the real election, the most important election, because whoever wins in the primary is likely to win in the general election. Because of redistricting, many of these seats are safe for Democrats or safe for Republicans. So much of the money is being pumped into these 25 competitive seats by the Democrats and Republicans, trying to keep a majority or get a majority by the Republicans. The Senate campaigns are much more competitive. This year in 2020, there are 12 Democratic seats that are up and 23 Republican seats that are up. And of those, about 4 Republican seats are toss-ups, too close to call at this point when we look at the polls. And there's 1 Democratic seat in Alabama that's a toss-up or a likely loss. I'll get into those later, and we can talk about that during the Q&A. The American electorate is highly partisan, it's sorted, and it's polarized, and it has been for quite a while. Sorting is the sociological phenomenon where people in certain areas, like rural areas, agree with each other, and people in urban areas agree with each other, and they're quite different in terms of their politics. That sorting is continuing, and as a result of these issues of the pandemic, whether you're going to close businesses and states and have social distancing and isolation for a long period of time, or whether you're going to open them up, will continue to be an issue, and it's highly polarized at this point. Polarization means that you have people on the far left and the far right, and frequently not very many people in the middle ideologically, and that is continuing in America. And one of the reasons for this polarization and gridlock is in our Constitution. We have elections that are quite different for the House, the Senate, and the presidency. The presidency is really an election this time in 7 or 8 battleground states with a particular kind of strategy, theme, and message. House members, of course, need to deal with the pandemic, need to deal with the economy and race, and also run with or against Trump. He's going to be a major issue. But it is not like a parliamentary system where you have a clear core of authority within a particular party, like in Great Britain, and it creates conflict. It creates rivals for power when they get in after they're elected, and that is reinforced by polarized voters. The voters are polarized in that urban, suburban, and rural voters are quite different in the way they vote. They're ideologically sorted. They go to the social media, to places where they agree and get reinforced in terms of their attitudes. And those attitudes influence the way they vote. Redistricting in America happens every 10 years after we take a census. And the redistricting is controlled in many states by the controlling party, and they draw lines around the sort. They draw lines around the geographic sort in the states, and that helps reinforce this polarization and tends to lead towards gridlock in the House and the Senate and in some state legislatures. The most important thing that's happened, though, since the late mid-60s is that we've had regional political realignment. The South, after the 64 and 65, 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, started to realign and change from Democratic Dixiecrats who were pretty conservative. They were segregationists. They were very different than Northern Democratic members and more moderate to liberal members. And so we really had three kinds of parties: the Southern Democrats, the Northern Democrats, and the Republican Party. When this realignment started, it started as a result of the Voting Rights Act allowing African Americans to register and vote more easily throughout America, but especially in the South. And they started electing people that represented their values and their policy positions throughout the South. To a great extent, it was in urban areas. When this began, many of the Dixiecrats, the people in the Democratic Party in the South, shifted and they became Republicans. Now, a realigning election is an example is FDR's first election. He successfully brought in many Republicans that supported him. They changed party identification for a generation, more than a couple of generations, and that realignment created the coalition for the Democratic Party. If you could go back to the last slide, I think that Trenton is controlling this right. No, got it. So the realignment is a basic fact that creates this polarization, helps create this polarization in the Senate and the House. The members from the South and also those from what I would call the cowboy states like Wyoming, North South Dakota, Nebraska, not the blue areas on the coast, that coalition really has a major impact upon the agenda of the House and the Senate. And that has created a situation where we have gridlock, where we don't have a clear majority one way or the other. It used to be actually in the 70s, early 80s, that we had a large block of people in the House and the Senate that would be called moderates. Blue dog Democrats, moderate Democrats that voted with Republicans, and liberal to moderate Republicans. Those names are no longer used, that would vote with Democrats. About a third of the House and the Senate voted that way into the 80s. And then it became more and more polarized with no one in the middle. Now, I mention this because one of Biden's campaign messages is that he can reach out and work with the other party. When Obama said, "I want to change the way Washington works," that was one of his messages. He was hoping to reach over and work with the other party. It has not been possible unless there's a crisis. A crisis drives different kinds of decision making, and that has been shown with respect to the money that's being invested to try to help people right now during this pandemic and during this high unemployment. The bills that have been passed, three major bills, lots of money, have almost been unanimous and bipartisan. Now the partisanship begins in terms of new kinds of legislation that will be passed or not, and there's a tendency for gridlock with that. So the partisan divide that we have really reflects deeper divisions in American society, and the racial divide is bubbling up right now. It's a very somber time seeing this. But the racial divide, the cultural divide, the ideological divide the parties. The Democratic Party has been attractive to African Americans, to Asians, to Latinos. The Republican Party is less attractive, and there are data to show in the polls that they're divided along racial lines. The cultural division is there also. There's deep divides between the parties, and it manifests itself in terms of elections and governing along lifestyles and values and things like should we have more regulation over guns? The Democratic Party would like to have that, the Republican Party not. Pro-life, pro-choice when it comes to abortion. The parties are divided with pro-choice for the Democrats, pro-life for the Republicans, and gay marriage and other issues really divide the party. We've got the parties divided on ideology, and this is coming out right now in the debate, and it will continue to come out in the debate, and that is Democrats and Republicans differ sharply on a wide range of issues that are now coming out again after these initial bills that have been passed to help with the pandemic about what is the proper role and size of government. This is really behind the debate that's going on right now and in the campaign with Republicans really pushing for more freedom, fewer regulations, lower taxes, less intervention by the state in policies in terms of healthcare, a variety of other areas. The Democrats basically pushing for more solutions from government, and certainly the Democratic Party is going to be doing that with respect to reactions to the pandemic, reactions to the economy, reactions to racial tensions. And some of the divisions within the Democratic Party have been healed over these issues, with Bernie Sanders wanting more intervention by the state in terms of the quality, access, finance of healthcare. Biden is really adopting many of those policies, but using different language than Bernie. Also, the Democrats would like to have more intervention to do something about global climate change or global warming, whatever you want to call it. And the Republicans, in many cases, think that this is not that important. We've pulled out of Paris. We are deregulating in EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and other areas that some people think will hurt solving this problem. Now, back to a bit about some data about how different the parties are. What you have in front of you are the House battles that were in the urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas in the last congressional election. And you'll see that 98% of the urban areas voted Democratic, 70.4% of suburban areas voted Democratic, and only 19% of the rural areas voted Democratic. We really have a major sorting going on, a major conflict going on, and to a great extent, the battle in this election will be in the suburban areas, and the Democrats and Republicans alike are spending a great deal of money focused on the suburban areas in battleground states. Now, there's too much information here, but you'll see that the parties are diverging in terms of college degrees, with many more people in the Democratic Party with college degrees and the Republicans with fewer college degrees. Education divides the parties. Gender divides the parties. As you can see, the number of people, men versus women, that want Democrats versus Republicans in terms of congressional control, one measure of this, huge change in 2019. You'll see that 56% of the women would prefer to have a Democratic Congress, and only 34% in the Democratic Party, only 34% in the Republican Party would want this. Geography, this is an interesting another way to measure sorting. It's looking at people by where they shop, and the share of rural versus urban, suburban counties. Whole Foods is a place that it's an expensive grocery store. It's in urban areas, and 54% of the people there in this poll shop in Whole Foods and among Democrats, but very few go to a Republican aligned restaurant that's indicated there. So another piece of data in a recent poll, the share of Republicans who say the Democratic Party has been taken over by socialists, 82%. Now, socialists in the United States, that term is very different than socialism throughout the world. In China and in Europe, it is really a negative term here in the United States. 82% of the Republicans think the Democratic Party is being taken over by socialists. That doesn't help you win when that is the case. The share of Republicans who say the Republican Party has been taken over by racists is 80%. It's another measure of this partisanship and this conflict that's going on that's behind the election right now. If you look at the issue of winning when you have an economic recession, we are probably in a depression right now statistically, but let's call it a recession. You can see that it's very hard to get reelected when the economy is bad. There's the only person that was reelected when we were in a recession was Coolidge in 1924. And no recession in 2 years before the election. All of these individuals have been reelected to the presidency. And we have a very bad economic situation, as well as the pandemic. And a lot of people think it's going to be very hard for Trump to get elected because of that. We'll see. The enthusiasm and turnout is really key to this election, as Steve said earlier. And I'd like to just briefly talk about that. We've had recent polls that show that the Republicans continue to be much more enthusiastic about Trump than Democrats are about Biden. Now, Steve said that, Biden has to, the joke is that he was doing the basement strategy. He's now upstairs, but he's doing the home strategy. He has programs every other day or so. No one really covers them, where he talks with people. He talks to potential voters. It's not going very well. On the other hand, Trump has been using campaign rallies until the pandemic came very cleverly in battleground states. He's been dominating the media every day with his pandemic briefings, but also with press conferences, with tweets. And remember, he was the first president really to be elected knowing how to use tweets, using tweets. Some of them are very questionable. Some of them are questionable in terms of their veracity, but it has worked to mobilize his base. Fundraising, Steve talked about it. This is somewhat dated. It's in March. Trump and the Republican National Committee had $225 million. Biden and the Democratic National Committee had $20 million. Money makes a difference if you know how to spend it. And they have been heavily investing in social media, they meaning Trump. Biden is just catching up with that. He's had some limits on the amount of money that he has. Trump has millions of followers on Facebook, but also his tweets. They follow it every day. It makes a difference. He has 75.9 million followers on Twitter, and 28 plus million on Facebook. And he was bragging the other day that he had more followers than anyone else on Facebook. Biden, on the other hand, is way behind on social media. This election, you'll need a great deal of sophistication and use of social media. And Biden has only 4.7 million on Twitter and 1.7 million on Facebook. That's something to watch very carefully. Now, enthusiasm. This is what I was talking about earlier. Steve was talking about it. Trump has, just to summarize this, on those who are very enthusiastic, he has almost twice as many people that are Republicans that are enthusiastic about him compared to Democrats. And the supporters who could be persuaded not to vote for Biden, that's pretty high percentage, and for Trump, only 17%. That's important to watch, the enthusiasm gap. Now, the Electoral College was mentioned briefly. As you know, it takes 270 votes to win. Trump won in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin last time by a net 78,000 votes, about 10,000 votes in Michigan. It was very close. Some people hypothesize that it was an intervention by Russia that made a difference. There are many other explanations. I lean towards the fact that in each of those three states, in each of them, there were 200 to 300,000 people who voted for third and fourth party candidates. That's important because in this election, that could be the factor that helps elect Trump. And so Biden is carefully trying to build a coalition with Bernie Sanders people, with other people, Elizabeth Warren's people, the people that he campaigned against, and they've all endorsed him. Now the question is, are they enthusiastic? Will they turn out? Arizona is a battleground state. It's in play. It's changing significantly over the past few elections. Florida is always a battleground state. Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Now the president has had events lately in these states, but before that, he's had major rallies that's helped motivate his base to increase the enthusiasm in those places. Michigan, he has been there recently. He's been attacking the Michigan governor. He's been saying things that are not very helpful in Michigan. So the latest polls show that he's behind almost by 10 points in Michigan. But these are only pictures at one point in time. They could change. The election's a long ways away. He actually is behind in all of these states, but it's all within margin of error in these surveys. Watch these battleground states when you're looking at the election. If you look at California, it will be overwhelmingly Democratic. New York, overwhelmingly Democratic. But in those places, they're places where the money comes from for these campaigns. So there's a money battle going on now, trying to bring in more money to the Biden campaign from those states, and that's something to watch. We have a transparent recording of how much money is coming in. There's a delay in it, but you can watch. You can find that out also from some of the links that I've sent to you earlier, and as part of the package of materials that you can use after this presentation. The Senate. Let's look at the Senate. It's competitive, as I mentioned before. It looks like Senator Jones, an incumbent that won barely in Alabama, it's really a Republican state, he's likely to lose in that state. And Senator McSally is in a toss-up. Senator Gardner is likely to lose in Colorado. Senator Collins, it's too close to call in Maine. Senator Tillis too close to call. This could end up being a tied Senate with 50-50 easily. And if that's the case, it creates a certain amount of problems. The Vice President of the United States, whoever it is, will break ties and votes, but the Senate, as you know, needs 60 votes in order to govern on most things, except for money bills, tax bills, and money bills. It needs 60 votes to overcome the filibuster. So we're likely, no matter what happens, even if we have unified party government, a Democratic Senate, House, and presidency, it's likely to be very hard to govern without reaching out and working cross-party lines. It's likely to be gridlocked again, unfortunately. The House elections, all I can say is what I said before, it's not competitive. The real election is the primary election in most cases. In some states, we have commissions that redistrict, and you have more competition in the general election. But in most places, like in Berkeley, California, if you win the Democratic primary there, you basically have won the general election because there are very few Republicans that are out there. And in upstate Idaho, it's the same thing for Republicans. It's really a Republican area. You win the primary there, you're going to win in the general election in most cases. Now, I think that there's this phenomenon called the October surprise before elections. Something dramatic happens in October. It is happening now in America. It's not October. This is a major issue of the racial tensions bubbling up as a result of the tragic death of this individual in Minneapolis. But if you're watching CNN or you have access to other sources, you'll see that this is just one of dozens of situations where people have died, African Americans have died as a result of excessive force. Over the last 10 years, there have been many of them. So let me conclude by saying that what if COVID, let's go back to that one, sorry. What if COVID-19 returns aggressively in the fall, as the Spanish flu did in 1918? It will have an impact on the election. What if states need to lock down the week of the election? What if a governor orders quarantines for blue cities but not red suburbs? What if at a higher risk seniors must stay home while those under 30 can vote? Now, it looks like in the polls that seniors in America are leaning heavily for Biden, not Trump. They are important to the Democratic Party. What if they must stay home? What if we cannot determine who won on election night? And some people think this is highly likely. It'll be like Bush v. Gore in 2000, but maybe even more complex and more tension. What if voters or election officials refuse to bring or wear a mask? And then, of course, there's the overall issue of mail-out ballots. Republicans don't really want this to happen in many places. They're making it more difficult for people to vote. It's become a controversy that's bubbled over into the courts. That's an issue also. If we can go to the next slide, or just why don't you go to me at this point? And I want to thank you very much for doing the slides for me. Let's open it up to questions and comments. I see that in the chat box we have, oh, that's for me. It's not a question. So I'd like to hear from anybody, and I want to thank Julia very much for inviting me to do this, and thank Steve for an outstanding lecture. He basically gave a presentation that takes an entire semester, and he did it with eloquence and thoroughness. It's a great summary. But I want to say hello to friends that I've known for many years in China. It's a pleasure to see you, even on Zoom. But let's open it up to any questions that you might have. Steve, let me just get things going by asking you a question. You can unmute maybe. What happens if we have, as I said in the last slide, a disputed election? What are the procedures when that happens?
Well, the disputed election first is decided by the person in charge of the election in the state, usually what is called the Secretary of State, who is an elected official. And whoever loses that dispute will take it to court. And then it will go all the way up to the state Supreme Court, which will make a decision. And then in all likelihood, that decision will go to the Supreme Court. So we're talking about several months of fighting over who's going to win a particular state.
Well, some people think, and I know it's just, they're hypothesizing that if it's extremely close, Trump will not give up the presidency. What happens then?
Well, we've never had that kind of a situation before in the United States.
Right.
And I think what you're proposing is what the Democrats really do fear at this moment. And I think the Supreme Court would probably have to make a judgment on who wins and who loses, and that judgment would have to be accepted by the president. But we don't know this. And if, let us say, a lot of the states tip Democratic, but by a small amount, the greater the electoral victory of the Democratic candidate, the harder I think it will be to contest the results of the election. In the election that you mentioned in 2000, between former Vice President Al Gore and George W. Bush, the dispute was in one state, the state of Florida. But this time around, I think you're right. The dispute is going to be in every state that's close. Both parties have set up big attorney-based systems, education lawyers, to look at the vote and to prepare a defense for their position. So it's going to be a little bit crazy.
Thank you. We have a question on the chat. Let me just summarize it by saying that the question is, how much of a turnout wave Biden needs in order to not repeat 2016, given the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on different groups of voters? That's very important. Let me just put the last election in context. In Michigan, Trump won by 10,000 plus votes. And it was the first time a Republican won in Michigan in almost 30 years. Some people have calculated that the turnout of African Americans just in Detroit was down 8% in that election, and that was enough to have easily helped Hillary win. Turnout is very important. It was extremely close in those 3 states. So the question is, Steve, what kind of effort does he need, and what do you think he's going to do in order to increase the turnout in those battleground states?
One of the reasons that Trump is opposed to people voting by absentee ballots is that he feels that the older people who might stay home because of the virus will be more likely to vote by absentee ballot. But a number of Republican governors also support the idea of absentee ballots. And in past elections, 1/3 of the electorate voted before Election Day. because there is a long period of time, in most states 30 days, when you can vote, either by a mail ballot or by coming to an election booth. I think the key to this election is, one, the votes of minorities within the cities. If that's high, and that's one of the reasons that there's pressure on Biden to choose an African-American woman to be the vice presidential candidate. The second consideration is the vote of women in suburban areas. That's what won it for the Democrats in 2018. And women are much more critical of Trump than are men. And the third consideration is the one you mentioned. What about the pandemic? And will it keep the over 65 people, who tend to be the ones who are most vulnerable to fatalities because of the COVID-19, will it keep them at home? If they can come out and vote, then Trump is in trouble. The demographics of the country favor the Democrats. And but the specific situations are the ones that are going to result in who wins and who loses this election. It's a very good question.
So just to put this in context, there are 31 states that allow easy early voting right now. And it's the percentage of people doing this has been increasing every election cycle. And there's very high turnout where you have easy early voting, meaning mail voting. It's been mail voting in Oregon for the last almost 20 years. They have about an 80% turnout in Oregon. I'm from Oregon, so I had a special conference out there about that, about how you campaign when you have a 10-day period of voting. And it's hard to campaign when people have many days to vote, and they have to take that into account also. 2018, by the way, had a historic turnout for a midterm election. People from the Democratic Party were especially enthusiastic. They elected 93 new Democrats for the House of Representatives. Many of them were women. Women in America were recruiting good people to run in the Democratic Party, and they won. Whether that enthusiasm continues because of anger with Trump we don't know. They're not that excited about Biden, but he's not Trump, and that's a major thing. Now, it's hard for me to let me see.
Can I make one statement?
Sure.
What this election is going to come down to in the end is a vote for or against Trump. It's not going to be so much a vote for Biden, but a vote against Trump.
So there are a couple questions. Thank you. I agree with that. It's about Trump. And he's the whole Biden strategy so far seems to be let Trump be Trump, because he continues to alienate people and say crazy things and tweet things that are questionable. We'll see whether, yes.
Professor Thurber, time is running out, and there are several questions about the impact of the elections on U.S.-China relations, as well as a question about whether you think that President Trump will invite Tsai Ing-wen to the United States, or the next administration will invite her to come to the United States. Because time is short, and we are going to have an entire session on really the results of the elections and its impact on U.S.-China relations. So let us, those of you who can wait, watch us, come and join us during that session. You'll get your answers. But before we have to leave, I really would like to ask one more question, and then let's wrap up. I've always wondered about the validity of approval ratings for politicians. Trump's approval rating or popularity has been sliding And I'm sure when the new figures come out, it'll be sliding even more because of the riots that we are experiencing that you've all talked about. So what do you think? Can we really account popularity as a major factor in predicting election, especially this one?
Well,
Yes.
I'm reluctant to predict elections. There was a poll that was reported in the Washington Post just yesterday, but it's only one point in time. And it reinforces what I was saying about enthusiasm. Trump has much more enthusiastic support from his party than Biden. Popularity and whether people will vote for a president or not in these polls is interesting, but I think the most important thing is to look at the polls as we get closer in the battleground states and look at potential turnout, look at enthusiasm and turnout. Now, if they're popular, okay, but it's probably related to enthusiasm and turnout, but look at those two factors. Steve, I interrupted you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say polls are important in two respects. One, not national polls. The national polls were right in the last election. Hillary did have a majority of the vote. But polls conducted within the states tend to be smaller. They tend to be sponsored by a news organization, something like that. They're very expensive to conduct. Thirdly, we have another phenomenon in the United States, and that is we get a lot of robocalls. And so a lot of people are not picking up the phone and are not responding to surveys. And that means that only 9% of the people that the Pew Research Organization are surveying are answering the survey. Are those 9% representative of the state and the country? So polls have become very, very iffy. And there is also difference between who participates on online polls and who participates in telephone polls.
So there's a couple of other questions. Thank you, Steve. A couple of other questions. One is, will the quote China card be used in this election? Well, Trump already is. I mean, he's been using it ever since he came into the presidency with respect to trade. And I think that Biden is going to be very different than Trump on that. With the situation in Hong Kong, this has become an issue that Trump will discuss. Now, whether it has an impact on the election is, in my opinion, is questionable. He's appealing to his base. The base is very concerned about losing jobs to China and a variety of other issues that he keeps pushing. And in the past, that really hasn't been a part of the election and that important to the election until Trump ran in 2016 as he's running now. Now, I think that Biden needs to address Trump's position on trade on Hong Kong, but I don't think it'll be a definitive factor in this election. Steve, what do you think?
Well, there'll be a lot of China bashing, in part because Trump can't talk about the economy if it's bad. He can't talk about the pandemic if it continues to exist. He can't really talk about race relations without sounding racist. So what he's doing now is blaming the virus, which he calls the China virus, on China, and then picturing Biden as soft on China. That's an appeal, as Jim Thurber just said, to his base. It's not going to affect the outcome of the election, but if Trump were reelected, it would affect, at least in the first year, U.S. policy towards China.
There was a question also, thanks, Steve, a question about whether our constitutional framework leads to a certain extent to the way our system is working right now and leads towards gridlock. As Steve knows, I have, and he's contributed to it, I have a whole book on this topic, American Gridlock, and it certainly does. But let me just assert that at this point, because it would take a long time to talk about that. I think there's controversies in political science about how much it contributes to that. But when you have people running for the House, homogeneous districts, and they do anything almost to get reelected locally, and people in the Senate from heterogeneous places like California, they will run on different topics, and president running separately, not in a parliamentary system where the legislature selects the leader of the country. You will have conflict, and that conflict leads towards gridlock when you have a highly polarized electorate, in my opinion.
Let me add one final thing. When you're talking about politicians, never underestimate the importance of personal ego.
I've never worked for a politician, and never met one that didn't have an insatiable ego. Maybe Obama was slightly different. He held it inside a bit more than Hubert Humphrey and this president and others. Yeah, ego is very important.
Well, I think Professor Thurber, you have the last word. Let me just say thank you to both of you for your wonderful presentations. I've learned a lot myself during your talks. We are delighted also to have had all of you join us. We will probably have the next session at least sometime in the summer, if not in July. And the focus of that section will be on the economy and on trade. So we look forward to having you again. Also, we will be sending a recap of this session because it was recorded, and additional resources within a few days to all the registered participants through our website. If you're not registered for this session, you can go to uset.org to register now so that you can receive the recording of the materials. So everyone, thank you all very much, and see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you very much,
Very much.
Ambassador.